Hey guys, I want to walk you through this nutrient management plan just to make sure you've got a good idea of what's in here and where to look for it. So right now I'm looking at the front page and you can see there's the name of the farmer. Here's the county and the watershed that the farm's in. Here's the name of the nutrient management planner that designed this. And here is the cropland and the livestock summary, so all of the creatures that they've got on the farm and all of the cropland. Down here below is total manure production per year, and that is in kilogallons, easy for me to say, which is thousands of gallons. So 771.9 means 771,900 gallons of manure produced by those 75 cows. If you go across, you'll see that he's actually using more manure this year in this plan than what his cows will produce. Obviously, he can't literally use more manure than is produced unless he is buying and importing some manure. What is likely going on here is that he's got some carryover. He probably had, let's see, it looks like it's 770, looks like he had about 70,000 gallons of manure maybe left over from the previous year. So he didn't enter this year with an empty manure. Next we come to this table, a dairy beef manure spreading schedule. And so this is not specific to this farm. Again, this is boilerplate. And what it's doing is basically saying don't spread manure in the wintertime because the ground is going to be frozen or saturated. Also for corn and cotton, it says don't spread manure in June, July, August, and September. Well, the ground isn't going to be frozen then, but the crop is going to be tall enough that they are not going to be able to get onto the field to spread. If you slide down a little bit, you'll see that manure application on hayland and pasture land and small grains is allowed, possibly not recommended, but allowed in an emergency. Why is that? Well, the main reason is that pasture and hayland are likely to have an intact sod even through the winter. And so there's at least a reasonable chance that the nutrients will be held by that sod, by the roots of the crop. Small grains are things like rye and barley and wheat that are literally planted in the fall and grow a little bit through the winter and into the spring. And so in the wintertime, whenever it warms up a bit, it is realistic to think that there's going to be a growing crop wherever he's got small grains planted. Moving on, we come to the manure production summary. This tells you how much manure is going to be produced by your animals. So here's your animal summary. Down below is, and what it's saying here is that it's pretty evenly produced throughout the year. Remember that this farm basically is 100% confinement, so that makes sense. They give you a very complicated formula down here that basically says total manure production in the year is manure produced per cow times the number of cows times 365 days a year. That's what that is. In the middle of this page are some pretty important values. When you get to section 4.2, we'll talk through this in detail, but what it's basically saying is of the manure, nitrogen, phosphorus, ammonia, and potassium, how much is going to be available to the crop when you apply it. The units on this page are pounds per thousand gallons. The abbreviations TKN is total Keldol nitrogen. That's total nitrogen content of the manure in pounds per thousand gallons. There's phosphate, pounds per thousand gallons, ammonia, and then potassium oxide or potash, ammonia, and then potassium oxide or potash in, again, pounds per thousand gallons of manure. Those are the units. Slide down and you'll see that this is telling you that if that manure is immediately incorporated, meaning that the farmer plows it under or injects it underneath the soil, then here's the amount of nutrients that will be available to the plant. On the other hand, if he surface applies it, just spreads it on the surface, here is the amount of nutrient that will be available to the plants. Residual nitrogen is the nitrogen that they expect to be left over next year, the year after, and the year after. And that's just because manure nitrogen degrades slowly over time. Again, we talk about that in more detail in that lesson 4.2. Next page is just showing you how they calculated the manure production per animal per year. So you've got 75 dairy cows, 100% confined. They average 1,400 pounds per cow. That's how much. The production factor is just a factor they use to estimate manure excretion. The units are gallons of manure per year per pound of animal. That's pretty obscure. You don't have to worry about it. It's just their way of estimating manure production. And then wastewater would be water used in washing up the farm, for instance, washing up the milking area. That will flow into the manure system, and then the total production per year. There's a feedlot runoff calculation, so if there is a lot that the cows are out on that drains to the manure storage, then you've got to account for the runoff from that feedlot. Now we're into the cropping information, and just stay with me and plug through this because it looks a little complicated. It looks like it's written in a foreign language, but you can do it. So looking up at the top, we've got all of the fields. HF-1, I'm going to guess that's like home farm, 1, 2, 3, da-da-da-da-da. He's got a and those fields are of varying size, everything from a 7-acre field up to a 34-acre field. Next is the predominant soil series. And I'm not going to dig too deep into that in this class. There are some great classes at Tech on soil chemistry, and it's actually quite interesting. But essentially, different types of soils are named different things. And so Dogue is a soil series that has a certain characteristics. Lenoir and Coxville and Weedowie, and I have no idea where these names come from. A lot of times it's the county where they are first observed. But that's just the name of the soil in that field. Slide over, and this you will get into in section 4.1, I think. What this is telling you is that different soils are good for different crops. Dogue is excellent for growing small grains or for grass hay. That's what that productivity group 1 tells you. Dogue is not very good at growing alfalfa. On the other hand, Lenoir really isn't very good anywhere across the board. Okay, productivity groups range from 1 to 5. So this Lenoir and Coxville, those two fields are pretty lousy for growing corn. They're pretty lousy for growing small grains. They are not suited at all to growing alfalfa, and you can maybe grow a little bit of grass hay on those fields, so those are kind of useless. Moving down, again, he's got some fields that really don't have very good soils, and then down here, this particular field, this HF9, has got this Alta Vista soil, and it's super for growing corn and small grains and alfalfa and grass hay. Down on the bottom is a little more detail about this productivity group, this Roman numeral 1 to 5. And again, it's important. So if a field is productivity group 1 for corn, that means you can expect to get 150 bushels per acre of corn from that field if you fertilize it reasonably. All the way down to if it's a productivity group 5 for corn, you might as well not bother planting the corn because you're just not going to get the yield no matter how well you fertilize it. And we talk about that in the Agronomy 101 section. So different fields will have different abilities to support different crops. This is the sheet where the nutrient management planner puts it all together, goes field by field, and determines the nutrient requirements of the crop grown on that field, how much manure to apply to that field, how much nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium that manure will supply, and then answer the question, do I have to bring on any additional commercial fertilizer? So let's start with this field HF1 right up top. So this field has 12 acres. Of the 12 acres, 12 are usable. This is a 3-year plan. When we start the plan, he's already got alfalfa planted in that field. You know that because it says alfalfa for hay maintenance. So if he was just planting alfalfa, just getting it established, it would say alfalfa hay establish. So it's maintenance. That crop does not require any nitrogen because alfalfa will fix its own nitrogen from the air. It does need some phosphorus. It needs some potassium. Go across. They do not recommend applying any manure to this field, and that's simply because the nitrogen would be wasted. Alfalfa doesn't need nitrogen, and in fact, if you apply nitrogen to an alfalfa field, you're going to suppress its natural ability to fix nitrogen. So therefore, we apply fertilizer to meet the needs of that crop. And you can see that it's recommending a fertilizer that has 0 pounds of nitrogen, 25 pounds of phosphorus, and 100 pounds of potassium. The BR is just how it is to be applied, that is broadcast. And you can see that they're recommending that the farmer go in twice a year. So put down this fertilizer once and then come back in a little bit later and put in the other. So that field's pretty straightforward. Now let's go down here. The second field, he's going to be growing corn and harvesting it as silage. And then in the wintertime, he'll be planting barley, and he will harvest that in the springtime for grain. So this is a double crop field. He's going to grow corn in the summer, harvest it in the fall. He's going to plant barley in the fall, harvest it in the spring. He needs to feed both of those crops. This is a pretty good field. It's going to yield HF2 is productivity group 2B for corn and 1 for small grains. So there's going to be good yield on this field. So it's got pretty high nutrient requirements. Slide across. This is the residual manure nitrogen. You'll understand that better when you get to lesson 4.3. The next column is where we get to the point of recommending how much manure ought to be applied to that field and in which season. The units here are thousands of gallons per acre. So this corn for silage in field HF2, the recommendation is that the farmer spread 7,500 gallons of manure per year, and that should be applied in the springtime. Pit just refers to the name of the manure. It's the manure from the regular storage pit. So that manure is going to supply 49 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 87 pounds of phosphate, and 149 pounds of potash. There's also this 7 pounds of nitrogen left over from last year's manure application, so we give that credit. And come across and we calculate that this field still needs, after we do the manure application, 85 pounds of nitrogen and a little bit of potassium. And here is the 85 pounds of nitrogen as a commercial nitrogen fertilizer over there on the right. SD is side dress. That's just an abbreviation for how the fertilizer will be applied. Notice that we've got 65 in parentheses for the phosphorus net requirement. What that's telling you is this field only needed 20 pounds of phosphorus per acre. The manure we're putting down supplies 87 pounds of phosphorus per acre. And so we are, in fact, over-applying phosphorus. This is the nitrogen-based nutrient management challenge. When you apply to meet or try to meet the nitrogen content of the crop, you're going to be over-applying phosphorus. As you slide down, you're going to see different crops come in. Soybeans are a legume. They don't require nitrogen. Fallow just means don't grow anything in that year. Here's corn for grain, rye for cover. Keep going. You've got corn for grain. You can read down. And in each case, here's the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that crop needs. Here's how much might be left over from last year, either from legumes or manure. How much manure to apply. How much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium will be supplied by that manure, how much the crop still needs, and then come over here and here's the commercial fertilizer recommendation. You notice that we're not always nailing it directly on the head. So like here, this sorghum Sudan, it says it still needs 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and yet it says it doesn't call for any nitrogen, commercial nitrogen. Well, that's just because it's really not worth it to run the tractor across the field just to spread 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The crop is probably going to do just fine. If you take a bit of a yield hit, you're still going to come out ahead because you haven't paid for the fuel to run that tractor across the field. That's the kind of practical experience that nutrient management planners bring to this process. They know when it is and when it isn't worth it to come through with commercial fertilizer.